Let's start with Green Beret, which was released in arcades towards the end of 1985 in all territories. This is a fairly simple action game in which you control a highly trained soldier sent behind enemy lines with just a bowie knife to begin with. You will mostly be stabbing the baddies, but sometimes one will drop a more powerful weapon, such as a flamethrower or a rocket launcher, which is handy for dealing with the more annoying enemy types, like the ones who come at you with a flying kick, or those that are firing mortars at you. The death effects were a bit grisly at the time, but are pretty tame nowadays. The difficulty is quite mild, at least to begin with, and with just a little bit of practice I was able to clear the first stage with all lives intact. The C64 port is a different matter, however. In all my time with the arcade version, I don't think the enemies fired their guns at me even once. Yet on the C64 they shoot at you at random, which always takes me by surprise. Visually things are obviously a lot blockier, but it's not too bad an effort for the time. You can have a decent amount of sprites on screen at the same time without any noticeable slowdown, which is key for a fast-paced game like this. The level design is fairly accurate to the arcades for the most part as well, and you can tell what the backgrounds are supposed to be depicting. So far though, I haven't managed to get past the first level on the C64. The game is much tougher. It's constantly throwing enemies at you, and your crucial special weapon is accessed by pressing the spacebar, which means you always have to be hovering over your keyboard so you can hit it before you die. The game has some great title screen music from Martin Galway, but the in-game tune is a bit repetitive. All in all, I don't think Green Beret is a bad game, far from it, but it's not the sort of thing that would have appealed to me back then either in the arcade or on a computer, hence why this is the very first time I have actually played it. All three of the Zap reviewers thought the game was quite good fun, but very challenging, though they weren't especially impressed with the visuals. Yes, they aren't really anything special, but at least they aren't slow or glitchy. Zap awarded Green Beret an overall score of 93%, which I feel is very high for such a basic and difficult game. I would place it squarely at 80% and no more, but then I have no nostalgia whatsoever for this title. Our second game is Mikie from 1984, which is a rather odd experience where you control a delinquent high school student in America and attempt to gather a certain number of hearts before you can move from one stage to the next. Things begin in the classroom where you have to butt bounce other students off their chairs in order to collect the hearts you need while avoiding the teacher. If you take a seat at a vacant desk, the teacher will lose interest in you and go back to writing on the blackboard. You can also headbutt the teacher in order to stun him for a few seconds, which is pretty vital because he moves very quickly. You then have to get out of the door into the corridor before heading on to the locker room. This time you are chased not only by the teacher who has followed you, but the janitor and what looks like a chef as well. You can pick up basketballs or American footballs and throw them at the staff so that they stop and dribble the ball, giving you time to slip away. So far this is as far as I've got. Mikie is a challenging game. The C64 version is a pretty faithful port, all things considered. This time though, the difficulty is lower on the computer version, at least during the earlier stages. The teacher runs a lot slower than he did in the arcade, there are fewer hearts to collect, and you only have one fire button to worry about rather than two. The headbutt move has been taken out of this version, probably because it doesn't really feel right for students to be attacking teachers, does it? You can shout instead, but it doesn't seem to have any effect on the teacher. The other major difference from the arcade is that sometimes the teacher will throw his false teeth at you. This can happen even when you sit down at an empty desk, so you are never truly safe. I think they've done a really good job of porting over the graphics this time around. All of the characters are nice and big, it's fairly clear what they are supposed to be, and they are well animated. The game has a lot of charm to it, and the music helps in this regard too, with a great rendition of Hard Day's Night playing throughout the first level. I quite like playing Mikie, it's something unique and different from most arcade games at the time. It would appear that Zap never got around to reviewing it though. My own personal score would be somewhere in the mid-80s I think, let's say 84%. I do have quite a bit of nostalgia for our third game because it is another one I played a lot on my BBC Micro long before getting my Commodore 64. It is Yie-Ar Kung Fu and it's great. The arcade version came out in 1984 for Japan and 1985 everywhere else. It's a one-on-one fighting game much like Street Fighter 2, but it came out way earlier. You can only control one character, which is Oolong, and there aren't really any special moves that you can perform, but you do have quite a wide variety of punches and kicks that you can pull off. You will be pitted against opponent after opponent who each wield their own weapons such as nunchucks, poles or chains, with each opponent being slightly more deadly than the last. Should you manage to defeat all of them, then the game simply loops back around to the start but gets a bit more difficult. This is something I got good enough to be able to do on the BBC version, but I've yet to manage it in the arcade or the C64. The arcade game looks great with neatly defined characters and some nice backgrounds, and there is also a nice use of sampled speech effects. Over on the C64 things are a little fuzzier as you would expect, but the game still looks pretty decent in my opinion. Each home port of the game seems to differ slightly from one another. They usually drop Fiedel, the enemy that splits themselves into multiple copies, which is the case here on the C64, but other versions have much fewer stages or different backgrounds. The bread bin port has retained the waterfall stage and the temple stage, which is nice to see. By necessity there is only one attack button now, which is used both for punch and kick depending on the direction you push the stick in, so it's a bit harder to perform exactly the move you want at any particular time. While I do think this is a fairly solid port all in all, it's not without its problems. The hit detection doesn't always feel as accurate as it should be, and certain enemies, such as Pole, have a habit of stun locking you until you are dead, which feels very unfair. Despite this, and despite the fact that Zap really weren't keen on the game at all, with a very average rating of 68%, I think this is my favourite game on this compilation. I think the score should be closer to 87%, and I'm going to award it the only first class rating for this particular compilation. Before I move on, special mention has to go to the title screen music, which is a rendition of a Jean-Michel Jarre tune. Not really sure what it's got to do with Kung Fu, but it's a really good piece of Sid music that I can just sit and listen to for quite a while. We still have two more games left to look at though. Number 4 is Konami's Ping Pong from 1985, and as the name suggests, this is a game based around the sport of table tennis or ping pong. As a sport, ping pong was and still is incredibly popular in Japan, so it's not really a surprise that Konami would decide to make this, or that it would be really popular in its home country. As a game, this is a pretty bare-bones simulation with simple but clean graphics and a control scheme which takes a while to master. I was useless at it, even when the game was set to the lowest of the 5 difficulty settings. I think I managed to score 3 points in a match once, with the idea being to get to 11 points before your opponent. I would imagine that the game only really comes to life in the 2-player mode though. You can spot the little penguin from that one Konami MSX game amongst the crowd, which is a cute touch. He even looks really disappointed when you lose. The C64 version is a faithful, solid but unremarkable port of the game. It resembles the arcade version almost 1-to-1, with just the slightly muted colour palette and the lack of crowd animations giving away which version you're playing. The controls are actually slightly easier than the arcade original too, which is a good thing. I just struggle to get excited about this game in any way because, well, it just isn't very exciting, is it? Looking at the Zap review, I'm shocked to discover that Imagine were originally charging $8.95 for this. It should be a $1.99 budget title at most, and it makes sense to stick it in a compilation with other more desirable games like this one. They gave it 66%, which is probably about right really, but it does make their score of 68 for Yie-Ar Kung Fu feel all the more harsh. Ping Pong is in my opinion the weakest game in this compilation, and it doesn't even have a 2-player mode to fall back on this time. That just leaves us with Hyper Sports, which is the sequel to Track and Field. The original Track and Field arcade game was incredibly popular, so in 1984 Konami decided to make a follow-up using the same formula but with all new events. In each event you are given a minimum score that you need to hit in order to move on to the next one, and 3 attempts to do so. If you fail, then it's game over. The events are a mixture of exhausting button mashing, such as the opening swimming event, and more skill-based fare like the skeet shooting and archery. The difficulty level really spikes during the Long Horse event, and I haven't managed to get past it either in the arcade version or the Commodore 64 port so far. Even back in the day I think I would use an action replay in order to get past this. Hypersports became quite famous in the UK because it was featured in a children's game show called First Class on TV along with Paperboy. That's how I first heard about it at any rate. I have to admit this is a pretty first-rate adaptation of the arcade game, with presentation that is almost as good as the arcade original, but I really don't enjoy button-mashing sports games, or most sports games in general, I'm afraid. Playing something like this would never be my first choice, no matter how polished it is, and while I respect the 90% review that Zap gave the game, in accordance with my own personal tastes I would rate it about 80% at most. Perhaps you think I'm being a tad unfair, and maybe so, but this is my own review after all. For what it matters, I do like the skeet shooting, and I would enjoy the archery as well, were it actually possible for me to get that far into the game. Games like this just aren't for me though, and that's okay. There are plenty of other titles on the C64 to keep me occupied. I think the main problem with this compilation overall is that the games feel rather dated. The games all came out around the middle stage of the C64's life, and in the years afterwards there were some much more ambitious and exciting arcade ports. Maybe we will be able to play some of those in a later compilation, we shall see. I'm going to be doing a viewer request for the next episode in the form of Wheels of Fire, which is a pack of 4 racing games from Domark. That will be along in 2 weeks' time, so I hope you can join me for it. In the meantime, take care.